Hey everybody, welcome back to the Anarchist audio library. Today we are reading an article from the New York Times. I don't love them as a source of journalism, especially after how they've treated Palestinians, but this article felt important enough to need to share. So, title is, Judge Rules the White House Failed to Comply with Court Order. The federal judge in Rhode Island said the Trump administration had failed to comply with his order, unfreezing billions of dollars in federal grants. This is written by Mattathias Schwartz, February 10th, 2025. A federal judge on Monday said the White House has defied this order to release billions of dollars in federal grants, marking the first time a judge has expressly declared that the Trump White House was disobeying a judicial mandate. The ruling by Judge John J. McConnell Jr. in Rhode Island federal court ordered Trump administration officials to comply with what he called, quote, the plain text, unquote, of an edict he issued on January 29th. That order, he wrote, was, quote, clear and unambiguous, and there are no impediments to the defendant's compliance with it, unquote. Shortly after the ruling, administration lawyers appealed his initial order to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, asking the appellate court to pause Judge McConnell's order to keep federal funds flowing while their case was being considered. The White House responded defiantly, quote, each executive order will hold up in court because every action of the Trump-Vance administration is completely lawful, unquote. Harrison Fields, a White House spokesman, said, quote, any legal challenge against it is nothing more than an attempt to undermine the will of the American people, unquote. The legal actions on Monday marked a step toward what could evolve quickly into a high-stakes showdown between the executive and judicial branches, a day after a social media post by Vice President J.D. Vance claimed that, quote, judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power, unquote. An outright refusal to comply with the judicial branch's constitutional oversight authority could be considered a constitutional crisis. Mr. Fields' statement suggested that the president would ultimately prevail in court, but neither he nor the Justice Department said what the White House would do in the meantime. It appeared that the administration would try to win through the legal system's established procedures, even as officials and their allies questioned the legitimacy of those procedures from the outside. To that end, some of Mr. Trump's allies accused the judge's ruling against Mr. Trump of overstepping their authority. Quote, activist judges must stop illegally meddling with the president's Article 2 powers, unquote, wrote Mike Davis, who heads the Article 3 Project, a conservative advocacy group. The Democratic attorneys general driving much of the legal pushback pressed their position. Quote, no administration is above the law, unquote, said Rob Bonta, the Attorney General of California, in a statement shortly after the order. Quote, the Trump administration must fully comply with the court's order, unquote. Already, more than 40 lawsuits have been filed against the Trump administration, challenging Mr. Trump's brazen moves, which have included revoking birthright citizenship and giving Elon Musk's teams access to sensitive Treasury Department payment systems. Judges have already ruled that many of these executive actions may violate existing statutes. On Monday, federal judges maintained a steady flow of challenges to Mr. Trump's authority, temporarily blocking the Trump administration from reducing health research grants and maintaining a stay on efforts to coax federal employees to quit. The question looming over Washington is how Mr. Trump will respond. Quote, it's very rare for a president not to comply with an order, unquote, said Victoria Norse, the director of the Georgetown Law Center on Congress and Democracy, who was formerly Joseph R. Biden Jr.'s general counsel during his years as vice president. Quote, this is part of a pattern where President Trump appears to be asserting authority that he doesn't have, unquote. Judge McConnell previously ordered the White House to unfreeze federal funds locked up by a memo from the White House Office of Management and Budget that demanded that billions of dollars in federal grants be held back until they were determined to comply with President Trump's priorities, including with ideological litmus tests, On Friday, 22 Democratic attorneys general went to Judge McConnell to accuse the White House of failing to comply with his earlier order. The Justice Department responded in a filing on Sunday that money for clean energy projects and transportation infrastructure allocated to states by the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill was exempt from the initial order because it had been paused under a different memo than the one that prompted the lawsuit. Judge McConnell's ruling on Monday explicitly rejected that argument. The judge granted the Attorney General's request for a, quote, motion for enforcement, unquote, essentially a nudge. It did not find that the Trump administration was in contempt of court or specify any penalties for failing to comply. However, the judge was straightforward in his finding that an initial temporary restraining order that he issued January 29th was not being followed. Quote, these pauses in funding violate the plain text of the TRO, unquote, Judge McConnell wrote. That earlier ruling ordered the administration not to, quote, pause, freeze, impede, block, cancel, or terminate, unquote, money that had already been allocated by Congress to the states to pay for Medicaid, school lunches, low-income housing subsidies, and other essential services. The judge also made clear that White House officials were obligated to comply, regardless of how they thought the case might conclude. In his ruling on Monday, the judge quoted an opinion from an unrelated case noting that, quote, persons who make private determinations of law and refuse to obey an order generally risk criminal contempt even if the order is ultimately ruled incorrect, unquote. Going forward, if Judge McConnell finds that the government is still ignoring his initial order, he could order more than a dozen administration officials named in the lawsuit to explain why they should not be held in contempt of court, and then punish them with imprisonment or, more likely, fines paid by their agencies, according to Adam Winkler, a professor at UCLA Law School. Quote, it's unlikely you can put the secretary of an agency in jail, unquote, he said. Quote, but you can. Unquote. The showdown is part of a broader effort by Mr. Trump's opponents to get congressionally approved funding flowing again. Another order requiring that the disputed funds be released was issued last Monday by Judge Lauren Ali Khan of the District of Columbia. That case was filed by a coalition of nonprofits represented by Democracy Forward. Skye Perryman, Democracy Forward's chief executive, said that if there were to be a standoff between the executive and judicial branches, she hoped that the legislative branch would step in. Quote, that is really a call to action for Congress, she said. The judicial branch is not going to be able to stop this unlawful and extreme use of executive power on its own, unquote. Compliance with the orders to unfreeze federal grants is at least partial, but it is difficult to gauge where funds remain stuck. The states have regained access to portals that allow them to be reimbursed for Medicaid. But David A. Super, a professor at Georgetown Law, said that he had heard directly from a number of groups, both inside and outside of government, that said their funding was still frozen. Quote, there's no question that the government is not complying, has not even come close to complying with the order, unquote, Mr. Super said. Quote, even funds that weren't frozen before the order are being frozen now, unquote. Mr. Super said Judge McConnell appeared to be trying to take the matter one step at a time. Quote, if you or I did this, the judge's clerk would be on the phone saying, bring your toothbrush to the hearing to show cause because you might not be coming home tonight. He said, this is the federal government, so the judge is trying to show restraint, expressing anger and reiterating its order, but not immediately bringing up penalties, unquote. The defiance may go beyond the domestic funding freeze. In another Monday filing, plaintiffs in a different lawsuit against the Trump administration said that the Trump administration was still putting employees of the U.S. Agency for International Development on administrative leave against a court order that ordered them to stop. Charlie Savage contributed reporting, Seamus Hughes contributed research. This is, once again, Judge Rules the White House Failed to Comply with Court Order by Mattathias Schwartz.